At Brussels International Airport, an unusually strange passenger suddenly appeared. A man took advantage of the security personnel's inattention, snatched a gun from their hands, and dashed towards the tarmac. Terenzio saw a plane with its door open and rushed aboard. Frightened by this scene, the flight attendant hurriedly tried to close the cabin door, but it was too late. Terenzio's gun was already inside. He forcefully pried open the cabin door and ordered the flight attendant to immediately close it. With no other choice, the flight attendant complied. However, the next second, Terenzio headed straight to the cockpit and pointed a gun at the pilot, demanding immediate takeoff. Terenzio was constantly muttering that if they didn't fly west to avoid the sun, everyone would die after sunrise. Faced with such a neurotic man, Matthew tried to disarm him but ended up with a bullet through his palm. Terenzio, indifferent to Matthew's injury, continued to urge him to take off quickly, but Matthew explained that with his injury and the co-pilot not on board, he was unable to perform the takeoff alone. Left with no choice, Terenzio rushed into the cabin and shouted at the group of terrified passengers, asking if anyone knew how to fly a plane. After repeated inquiries, Sylvie, who had once been a soldier, raised her hand and said she knew how to fly a helicopter. So, after some struggle between Matthew and Sylvie, the plane took off successfully. Matthew asked Terenzio where they were heading, to which Terenzio replied, westward. Seeing the plane successfully airborne, Terenzio's tense nerves finally relaxed. Unfortunately, the radio on the plane was damaged by the gunshot earlier, meaning they had lost all contact with the ground. During the flight, to prove to Matthew and Sylvie that he wasn't a terrorist, Terenzio began to explain. He revealed he was actually a NATO major. During a mission, he accidentally overheard a shocking message. The sun was undergoing a mutation, and any living creature exposed to its light would die. Of course, Sylvie didn't believe his nonsense and changed the subject to the urgency of treating Matthew's wound. With Terenzio's consent, Sylvie left the cockpit and asked the dozens of passengers if there was a doctor present. Laura spoke up, saying she wasn't a doctor but knew some basic nursing knowledge. While treating the wound, Matthew and Terenzio came to an agreement. Matthew said he would follow Terenzio's route, but to avoid panic, they mustn't tell the passengers about the sun's mutation. Then, Terenzio stepped out of the cockpit and watched over the restless passengers. Meanwhile, Matthew announced through the intercom the plane's direction. They intended to fly west towards Iceland. After delivering this unusual passenger there, they would return to their original destination, Moscow in the east. Hearing this, the passengers on the plane immediately erupted into chaos. The plane was preparing to land, but at that moment, Matthew saw something utterly astonishing. The tarmac was ablaze, and a crowd of people was rushing towards them. They seemed to be trying to seize the plane. With no other option, Matthew had to continue ascending. It dawned on him then that Terenzio's warnings about a sudden mutation of the sun might indeed be true. Just an hour ago, a man claiming to be a NATO major hijacked a plane bound for Moscow and forced Matthew to divert to Iceland. Hearing this, the passengers became restless. Zara stood up, her voice filled with determination. She explained that her child had a life-or-death surgery scheduled in Moscow the following day. Showing the resolve of a mother, she disregarded her own safety and approached the major to argue. But just then, a painful roar erupted from the cockpit, breaking the tense stalemate. Due to a lack of medical supplies, Laura had to resort to cauterizing the wound to stop Matthew's bleeding. A young man suddenly and inexplicably suffers from dry heaves and Laura rushes over to help him. Amid the confusion, a man named Ayaz seized the moment and snatched the gun from Terenzio while he was distracted. Ayaz then had Gabrielle lock Terenzio in the lavatory. With the crisis seemingly averted, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Ayaz, having heard their conversation about the sun's mutation, questioned Matthew's belief in Terenzio. Matthew explained that he was just playing along to stabilize the situation and intended to land and alert the authorities as soon as possible. Convinced, Ayaz handed the gun to Matthew. Soon, the plane neared a nearby airport. However, as they prepared to land, Matthew saw something horrific through the window. The airport was engulfed in flames, lifeless and impossible for landing. The other passengers saw it too, and panic instantly spread. Could it be as Terenzio had said? Was the apocalypse truly upon them? The plane had to continue flying. They hastily released Terenzio from the lavatory, hoping for more details. Seeing that everyone finally believed him, Terenzio revealed the truth. The sun had indeed mutated. Any living thing exposed to its light would perish. They had to fly westward at full speed, towards the darkness, to stand a chance of survival. But then, Sylvie shared some unfortunate news. The plane only had enough fuel for another 80 kilometers, nowhere near enough to reach the nearest airport. They had to find a long enough runway to land within 80 kilometers, and to their despair, the sun was set to rise in an hour. Hearing this, everyone plunged into fear. Some began to compose final messages to their families. Others recorded their last videos, but without radio or internet, their messages and videos couldn't be sent. Fortunately, Matthew finally spotted a somewhat open area, but due to Terenzio's gunshot, parts of the engine were damaged, and they had to make an emergency crash landing.
On va se le prendre! On va se le prendre!
Je vais pas le prendre!
Miraculously, with Sylvie and Matthew's perfect coordination, the plane stopped just a second before hitting an obstacle. Once the plane was secure, everyone eagerly disembarked, desperate to see if things were as Terenzio had claimed. On the ground, their phones finally got a signal. Everyone hurriedly called their loved ones, urging them to take cover indoors, but without exception, no one answered. Through the internet, they finally confirmed that the apocalypse had indeed arrived. Just then, a jeep sped towards them, and 3 soldiers alighted from the vehicle.
What have you heard? Where are you coming from? Russ?
In half an hour, the sun will rise, and this doomsday flight must race westward into the darkness before the sun comes up. As the radio was restored, people finally discovered the truth of the apocalypse online. A reversal in the sun led to a severe gamma ray burst, with a force equivalent to 1 trillion neutron bombs exploding every second. Any living thing exposed to the sun's rays would be instantly annihilated. Horst, the most educated scientist on the plane, explained to everyone that the sun's magnetic fields reverse every few years. Usually, this doesn't cause significant effects, but this time the reversal triggered the gamma rays. This gamma ray might have been the same phenomenon that caused the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Amidst the fear, Ayaz pulled Sylvie aside into the lounge to show her news on the tablet. It turns out the 3 soldiers who had just joined them were actually war criminals, guilty of murder and rape abroad. What was thought to be reinforcements turned out to be a threat. Half an hour earlier, after they had landed on a stretch of land, a jeep sped towards them. 3 soldiers alighted, claiming they were former mechanics and pilots wanting to join the escape. This seemed like a strong reinforcement, and without much thought, they were accepted. But the soldiers also brought devastating news. Even hiding indoors or in ordinary bunkers wouldn't save anyone if even a sliver of sunlight penetrated. Belgium had already dawned, and their loved ones were likely in grave danger. Despite the grief, the escape had to continue. In the next hour, they needed to stock up on fuel and food. With the 3 new additions, they quickly completed the task and even managed to fix the plane's radio. But a crisis struck again. Zara, worried about her seriously ill child's ability to endure a long flight and unaware of the apocalypse, insisted on staying. Sylvie, showing uncommon decisiveness and intelligence, suggested Gabrielle take the child first, then helped sedate Zara with Laura's assistance and carried her onto the plane. As the cabin door closed, the doomsday flight took off once more, but unknown to the rest, the 3 new additions posed another crisis. As if to confirm their fears, one soldier began to act recklessly inside the cabin and accidentally killed an elderly passenger. Facing accusations, the soldier pulled out a Desert Eagle. Sylvie, thinking quickly, claimed the old man had died from a fall. Defusing the imminent crisis, to plan their escape from these soldiers, Sylvie communicated with Matthew in French under the guise of helping him change his bandages. She informed Matthew about the soldiers' true identities as war criminals. The soldiers, not understanding French, were discontent with their conversation. Sylvie calmly replied they were discussing medical terms. Soon, the plane landed at a secluded airstrip. With 2 hours until sunrise, they had ample time to gather supplies. Matthew intentionally sent the 3 soldiers to look for a radio alone, but the soldiers, ever vigilant, insisted someone accompany them. They chose Jakub and Gabrielle. After they left, Matthew revealed the situation to the others and instructed them to return quickly after collecting supplies. Planning to depart before the soldiers' return, he also disclosed that Jakub knew the truth and would help Gabrielle escape from the soldiers. When they arrived in town, it was already eerily quiet. Abandoned cars and bodies littered the corners. Even those in their vehicles hadn't survived. Soon, they found a mechanic shop, while the soldiers searched the storeroom for a radio. Jakub quickly locked the door and pulled Gabrielle outside. Gabrielle, confused, didn't understand why they were running. Even as Jakub explained the men were murderers while urging her to run, she stood frozen, hearing the violent banging from the storeroom. Jakub realized it was too late to explain further and dashed off alone. Driving away in a car, Meanwhile, the soldiers had broken down the door and were in hot pursuit in another vehicle. Gabrielle stood alone, bewildered as dawn approached. Back at the airstrip, everyone aboard the plane anxiously awaited Jakub and Gabrielle's return. Soon, Jakub returned, running and telling Ayaz that Gabrielle couldn't come back. As the three soldiers approached, Ayaz kicked away the stairs and quickly closed the cabin door. Matthew, upon learning Gabrielle didn't make it, showed profound grief, but they had to leave her behind for the safety of everyone on the plane. On the ground, the three soldiers sprinted towards the plane, pulling out their guns and shooting wildly. The plane had just taken off when Richard noticed a bullet hole in the window. He immediately yelled for Matthew to stop the takeoff but was met with refusal, because the plane was to chase the sun westward, and once the sun appeared, everyone would die. Having finally shaken off the bad guys, the atmosphere on the plane lightened. Ayaz was peeling an orange for the sick Dominic. As they were bonding, Zara came over, took Dominic away, and warned Ayaz not to expect her approval by getting close to her child. Looking at Zara's serious face, Ayaz felt he had never been so speechless in his life. Just then, Terenzio and Richard started causing trouble again. They monopolized the plane's resources and forced everyone to agree on a rule. That is, from now on, all major decisions can't be made by Matthew or Sylvie alone. A democratic vote must be held, Terenzio emphasized to Ayaz, especially about the matter of throwing people off the plane. Ayaz scoffed at their demands, which angered them. As they were about to come to blows, the plane's alarm system suddenly went off. Matthew and Sylvie hurriedly flipped through the manual to find the cause, but the alarm suddenly stopped. Before they could catch their breath, the alarm sounded again, but Matthew lightly pressed it off once more. Having experienced 2 false alarms, the experienced Matthew deduced someone was tampering with the landing gear. Indeed, it was the soldier they had thrown out earlier, who had climbed into the plane's underbelly by grabbing the landing gear during takeoff. Matthew shared this information with everyone. Jakub quickly added that if the hydraulic system in the landing gear was damaged by the soldier, the wheels couldn't be deployed during landing, posing a significant crash risk. Fortunately, they thought of a solution. If the plane flew to 1,500 meters, the temperature would drop to -40 degrees, and the oxygen would become very thin. When the landing gear was deployed, the soldier would fall due to lack of oxygen or freezing, but obviously, they overlooked a crucial detail. The higher the plane flew, the greater the pressure difference inside and outside the cabin. By the time Laura noticed the glass shattering, it was too late. The outside air poured in like a tide, and those with weaker endurance passed out from lack of oxygen in just a few seconds. Matthew urgently reminded the passengers to put on oxygen masks, and he had to retract the landing gear and lower the flight altitude. At that moment, the window acted like a giant vortex, sucking everything in the cabin out. Jakub found a metal sheet to hide behind, averting the crisis. But then, Dominic had another problem. His breathing tube had just been blown away by the airflow, and he couldn't breathe. Luckily, Ayaz quickly used a knife to cut the tube from the oxygen mask, made 2 small holes in it, and connected it to the breathing machine, saving Dominic's life. Meanwhile, the cockpit sounded an alarm again. Matthew saw the soldier approaching the hydraulic system. It seemed the brief climb in altitude hadn't made him fall. Now the only solution was to enter the plane's underbelly and deal with the soldier manually. Soon, Terenzio, accompanied by Ayaz and Jakub, entered the cargo hold and used a welding torch to cut through the bottom of the cabin. Below should be where the soldier was. Terenzio prepared to shoot. Everything was ready. Jakub pulled open the iron plate, and it was pitch black inside. They couldn't see anything. Just then, a hand suddenly grabbed the gun, turned it downwards forcefully, and bit Terenzio's hand with its teeth. In a critical moment, Ayaz snatched the gun and shot wildly at the soldier, finally dealing with him. But when they returned to the cabin, no one applauded Ayaz's bravery. Instead, they all looked at him strangely, because just now, they discovered that Ayaz was hiding a deeper sin. It was already the end of the world, yet this group of survivors started to put Ayaz on trial. Should they abandon Ayaz or continue the journey with him? Not long ago, as Ayaz went to eliminate a soldier hiding on the luggage rack, the passengers learned a shocking piece of news. That is, Ayaz was also a murderer. Osman accused Ayaz of this crime. When they stopped in Canada, Osman and Ayaz buried a young man who died after swallowing diamonds, but inadvertently, he saw Ayaz cut open the young man's stomach and remove something. Without a doubt, everyone believed Ayaz coveted the diamonds inside the youth. which led to his death. Facing everyone's strange looks, Ayaz didn't choose to hide but revealed the truth. What he removed from the corpse wasn't diamonds but more precious emeralds. Ayaz continued to explain that these emeralds originally belonged to his country, and the deceased youth was actually hired by him. He had planned to smuggle the gems back to his country using the youth's body. Unexpectedly, the youth didn't follow the correct packaging instructions, leading to a fatal hemorrhage. His choice of this extreme method was because the gems originally belonged to his country. The Western powers had stolen the emeralds in the last century, and all he was doing now was to return them to their rightful owner. Their so-called demon was merely an ordinary patriot. After learning the truth, the passengers' feelings softened, but they were not fully convinced by Ayaz's explanation. Even if everything he said was true, the youth's death was still caused by him, and cutting open the deceased's stomach was the utmost desecration. These actions were no different in essence from those of the three soldiers.
Sur enfermer ce terroriste ici, jusqu'à ce qu'on détermine sa sentence appropriée. J'ai les menottes ici?
Finally, after a vote, the passengers decided to temporarily detain Ayaz and planned to abandon him at the next stop to resupply. The hero who had been saving everyone just a second ago had now become a prisoner despised by all. It was truly ironic. Soon, the plane reached its destination. After refueling and repairing the glass, they were ready to take off again, but Ayaz would be mercilessly abandoned. At that moment, Terenzio, whose life Ayaz had once saved, stood up. He declared that if Ayaz wasn't with them, he wouldn't guide everyone to the shelter. It turned out that while Terenzio had overheard the solar anomaly, he had also heard the military mention a shelter. Although he didn't know the exact location of the shelter, there was hope of survival if they could circle back to Belgium to find the meeting records. Under the pressure of survival, the passengers reluctantly agreed to continue with Ayaz. But obviously, things wouldn't end so smoothly. After returning to the plane, Ayaz first gave Osman a meaningful look. Then he went straight to the sick Dominic to inquire if his breathing was smooth. But Zara, as if she had forgotten that Ayaz had saved her child, coldly asked Ayaz to leave. Wanting no further contact with him, the plane took off again before dawn. That's when Horst found Matthew and told him another despairing piece of news. Due to the solar anomaly and increased ionizing radiation, not only can it change the atomic structure of humans leading to death, but it can also disturb the DNA of food. This means that the fresh food on the ground will have no nutritional value, and they will have to rely on the remaining food on the plane to survive. Hearing this, Sylvie and Matthew fell into extreme panic, but to avoid internal conflicts over food, they decided to keep this matter a secret. However, they were about to face a new crisis. After flying normally for a while, the plane suddenly experienced severe turbulence. Just then, two passengers dragged Matthew out, and the uninformed crowd thought they were crazy. That was until Matthew collapsed to the ground. Just half an hour before, the plane had been flying normally when it suddenly experienced severe turbulence. Sylvie hurried to the cockpit to inquire about the situation. Matthew responded that he might be disoriented due to the long flight time, leading to a control error. But even so, Matthew was reluctant to rest. Having no choice, Sylvie resorted to force, getting two people to carry Matthew out of the cockpit forcefully. Matthew lay on the ground in pain, but he still insisted he was all right, attributing his condition to the cabin's excessive heat. Afterward, Matthew went into the restroom. At that moment, the plane's radio equipment suddenly started making crackling electric noises. Jakub, Horst, and Terenzio hurried down to the cabin to listen for any potential communication signals. As they listened intently, a vague human voice came through. Could it be that, apart from them, other humans had survived? Upon closer identification, Jakub confirmed the voice was speaking Russian and quickly went to the cabin to ask Gabriel, a Russian passenger, for help in translating. After listening for a while, Gabriel discerned words like sunrise, stars, and space. From this, they arrived at an astonishing conclusion. Could it be a Russian astronaut communicating from a space station? Jakub couldn't help but joke that this guy's situation seemed even worse than theirs, but it was clearly not a time for jokes. If the astronaut was indeed on a space station, how had he survived the bombardment of gamma rays? Jakub insisted they must inform Matthew immediately, but when he reached the cockpit, only Sylvie and Ines were there. Matthew was nowhere to be found. Returning to the cabin, other passengers also reported not seeing Matthew. That's when Laura remembered that Matthew had entered the restroom and hadn't come out. They quickly opened the door to find Matthew had fainted. Laura immediately examined Matthew and discovered he had severe fever. low blood pressure, and weak breathing. From the symptoms, it appeared Matthew might have sepsis, likely caused by the gunshot wound inflicted by Terenzio not long ago. The infected tissue needed to be removed immediately, but such surgery required a sterile operating room. Then a huge problem arose. With the current medical conditions on the plane, such an operation was impossible, and there was no professional surgeon on board to perform it. Ayaz said to Laura, "Aren't you a doctor?" But Laura broke down. "I'm only a veterinarian, and now you're asking me to perform surgery?" With no other options, it seemed they couldn't wake Matthew for now and could only maintain his life with antibiotics until the plane landed, and they found another solution. As the topic turned to landing, everyone immediately faced another problem. With Matthew incapacitated, who could land the plane? They looked at each other, wondering if they had to entrust everyone's lives to helicopter pilot Sylvie, but it seemed there was no other choice. The immediate priority was to ensure everyone's safe landing.
Je sais activer ou désactiver le pilote automatique. J'ai ajusté les flaps et le palonnier, mais...
Sylvie was following a video tutorial to learn how to land the plane. Just moments ago, Matthew had fallen into a deep coma due to exhaustion and sepsis caused by his wound, meaning the plane couldn't be landed. With no other options, everyone had to place their last hope on Sylvie. However, Sylvie stated she had never piloted a large commercial aircraft before. She could help switch the autopilot on, but landing was a complex task she knew nothing about. Hearing this, Horst suddenly proposed a bold idea. They could learn to fly the plane by watching online videos. Although the idea was crazy, they had no other choice. So, after an incredibly tense journey, Belgium's international airport came into view. Jakub opened the instructional video, and Sylvie had no choice but to follow the steps. But soon, they encountered a major problem. The right engine of the plane malfunctioned, and the aircraft began to experience severe turbulence. Passengers quickly buckled their seatbelts and braced for an emergency landing. Whether they would live or die was now up to fate. Sylvie, in a frantic rush with Jakub, watched the tutorial video and successfully lowered the plane's landing gear, then adjusted the wings position. As the altitude decreased, the shaking of the aircraft became more intense. Even though the passengers were prepared, the situation was incredibly chaotic. Horst riskily got Laura up, and they both tightly protected Matthew. The plane continued to descend. 100 meters, 90 meters, 80 meters.
Préviens tout le monde de se mettre en position de sécurité.
Passengers began to calmly await the final outcome. With a heavy jolt, the plane tilted and slid onto the runway. Sylvie quickly pulled the brake lever. After a series of heart-stopping maneuvers, the plane finally came to a slow stop. Everyone couldn't believe that Sylvie had actually done it. Sylvie and Jakub finally breathed a sigh of relief. When they reached the cabin, the passengers gave them a round of warm applause. At that moment, Sylvie was everyone's hero. After a brief moment of joy, Sylvie began to assign tasks. Laura and Horst were to find a hospital for Matthew's surgery. Osman and Ines were tasked with collecting food. And Terenzio, along with Ayaz, went to find the exact location of the NATO base shelter. Just as everyone was preparing to act, Jakub revealed a piece of information that left everyone breathless. Upon inspecting the plane, Jakub discovered a significant issue. The sudden engine failure during the landing was due to a problem with the fuel. Horst speculated that if the sun could disrupt the molecular structure of food, it could also negatively affect aviation fuel. This news shattered the glimmer of hope that had just been kindled among everyone. Even if they found the shelter, if the plane couldn't take off properly, they would be unable to reach it.
Qu'est-ce que tu vas faire?
The apocalyptic flight that circled the globe landed back at its starting point, Belgium's capital international airport. Due to the solar anomaly, the ground was littered with densely packed corpses. The primary task facing the escape team was to revive Matthew, who had fallen into a deep coma due to exhaustion and sepsis. Upon reaching the hospital, the team found it deserted. Laura pulled back a black plastic sheet only to be shocked by the sight of bodies piled up. Clearly, these people thought hiding under the cover would save them, not realizing that even a sliver of sunlight meant certain doom. Laura understood that they had to perform surgery on Matthew immediately. If the plane couldn't take off, the escape team would meet the same fate as those people. Fortunately, Laura's surgery was successful. Matthew gradually regained consciousness but was still immobile. Despite his weakness and the looming departure time, the team had no choice but to carry him back to the airport. At the airport, they faced a more daunting problem. The solar mutation had caused all the ground fuel to deteriorate. This meant that even if they found the shelter, they wouldn't be able to reach it if the plane couldn't take off. Just when all seemed lost, Osman stepped forward. Having worked at the airport for years, He knew of a fuel storage base where the fuel was stored tens of meters under the water's surface, possibly safe from solar contamination. This news revitalized the escape team. Sylvie reassigned tasks, directing Osman and Jakub to the fuel storage base and going with Ines to collect canned food. The group began to split up. Meanwhile, Terenzio, Ayaz, and Richard arrived at a NATO base, respecting the soldiers' corpses still at their posts. Terenzio saluted them. Then they came to a conference room. It was here that Terenzio overheard the news of the sun's mutation. They hoped to find clues to the shelter in the meeting records on the table, but soon they discovered only some useless scraps of paper left. At that moment, Richard noticed the surveillance equipment on the wall. Military surveillance usually has audio, so finding the tape would lead to the meeting videos. So, Richard went to the surveillance room to check the videos, while Ayaz and Terenzio stayed to continue sifting through the materials. But as they were perusing a document mentioning romantic Turkey, Terenzio couldn't help but make a few jests. And Turkey was Ayaz's homeland. Ayaz warned Terenzio, "Insult me, but please do not insult my country. How could a man once esteemed as a major tolerate someone slapping his face?" Terenzio stepped forward with a left hook, but Ayaz, not to be outdone, sent Terenzio flying with a shove. Thus, the two were ensnared in an intense scuffle. But how could Terenzio possibly be a match for the burly Ayaz? Seeing he couldn't win, the infuriated Terenzio snatched a gun from the table. As the two were at a standoff, Terenzio grabbed a wine bottle from the table and smashed it hard onto Ayaz's forehead. Coming down later, Terenzio tried to wake Ayaz, but there was no response. Thinking he had accidentally killed Ayaz, Terenzio hurriedly found Richard in the surveillance room. When Richard asked about the wound on his face, Terenzio lied, claiming he fell accidentally and brushed it off, saying Ayaz had gone to the airport alone. By then, Richard had found the approximate location of the shelter, a place in Bulgaria. After achieving their goal, the two hurriedly rushed to the airport. The three men go off to find the location of the shelter and return with Ayaz missing, which Terenzio denies vigorously in the face of inquiries from the passengers on board. But Richard, who obviously knew the inside story, could only reveal a shocking secret under pressure from the crowd. He saw on the NATO base's surveillance camera that Ayaz was lying on the ground, life and death unknown, and Terenzio, who was with Ayaz, was a major suspect. Seeing his secret exposed, Terenzio tried to frame Richard for Ayaz's murder. As the passengers were about to take coercive measures against Terenzio, Matthew informed everyone that the plane was about to take off, or everyone here would die at sunrise. The passengers waited anxiously, still harboring a glimmer of hope that Ayaz would catch this flight. Through the window, Terenzio too stared outside, his expression complex. As Matthew and Sylvie started the plane, they began to taxi on the runway. Just then, a car sped toward them from ahead, and as the door opened, they saw it was the injured Ayaz. 1 second before takeoff, Ayaz finally caught the last flight of the apocalypse. Terenzio, once a savior of all the passengers, is now bound by people, because just moments ago, he knocked Ayaz unconscious and heartlessly abandoned him. And now, Terenzio must pay for his sins. After a unanimous vote, everyone decided to abandon Terenzio at the next stop. Ayaz, injured all over, went to the restroom. From his physical condition, it was obvious Ayaz was in serious trouble, but he didn't plan to tell anyone to avoid worrying them. Meanwhile, Richard located the approximate position of the shelter, a hydroelectric station in Bulgaria, but the precision of the coordinates he heard could only be accurate to 2 decimal places. This meant they had to search for the bunker's entrance within a 250-meter radius in every direction. Terenzio, locked in the cabin, spoke up, saying he had been a scout and could help in the search. Clearly, no one was willing to take his offer. Then, Sylvie announced the next landing location for the plane. Due to geographical constraints, they had to land at an Air Force base 15 kilometers away from the bunker, and it's only half an hour to sunrise after we get off the plane. This meant they had to travel 15 kilometers in 30 minutes and then accurately find the shelter. Hearing this, everyone panicked. Of course, the most worried were Zara. Dominic was seriously ill and couldn't run. If there were no vehicles at the airbase, it would be a death sentence for both of them. Soon after, a hesitant Zara approached Ayaz, lifting her shirt to reveal a scar. It turned out, to raise the exorbitant treatment fee for Dominic, she had reluctantly sold one of her kidneys a week before boarding the plane. She had planned to go to Moscow for Dominic's surgery, not expecting to encounter the end of the world. Zara was well aware that with her current condition, even without her son, running 15 kilometers in 30 minutes was pure fantasy. So, She begged Ayaz that if she couldn't keep up with the group, he must carry her son, but Ayaz seemed to have forgotten his own body was not in a much better state. As the plane was about to land to save more time, Matthew informed everyone that no luggage could be taken. Hearing this, everyone tensed up, knowing they were about to race against death. Sylvie came to the passenger cabin and timed everyone. Once everything was ready, Sylvie asked what should be done with Terenzio. To everyone's surprise, Ayaz chose to forgive him. If they were destined to die today, he didn't want his last act to be sentencing someone else to death. But Richard said letting Terenzio go was one thing, but his handcuffs could not be removed, because forgiveness and forgetting are two different things. The plane began to land, facing the most critical 30 minutes of their lives. Everyone was fully geared up, because they had no other choice. They must find the shelter 15 kilometers away before the sun rises, or else everyone would perish. Fortunately, Ayaz and Sylvie quickly found vehicles, and they swiftly took everyone away from the plane. Two cars, one after the other, sped towards the bunker. Just a few minutes later, Ayaz suddenly started foaming at the mouth, clearly suffering severe aftermath from Terenzio's previous blow. Ayaz, in a daze, drove the car straight into the roadside guardrail. Fortunately, no one was seriously injured, but the car broke down, forcing them to hurriedly disembark and proceed on foot. Meanwhile, Sylvie and the others, unaware of the accident behind them, correctly turned right at a crossroad and quickly arrived at the bunker checkpoint. However, as they passed through the gate, it began to close slowly. Everyone immediately got out to stop the gate from shutting. Unaware of the high voltage, Osman was electrocuted and passed out instantly. Luckily, he let go in time and didn't suffer any life-threatening injuries. At that moment, Matthew pressed a nearby switch, and the gate indeed reopened, but as soon as he let go, it closed again. Clearly, the switch needed to be continuously pressed to keep the gate open. With only 16 minutes left, everyone was at a loss. Terenzio stepped forward and said that in order to make amends, he would keep the button pressed until the rear car came in and then return to the bunker with them. Everyone tacitly agreed to Terenzio's proposal. As Richard was about to release Terenzio's handcuffs, Sylvie approached. Sylvie instructed the others to take Osman and find the route while she would unlock Terenzio's handcuffs. Obviously, Sylvie didn't fully trust Terenzio. After unlocking one handcuff, she instead locked Terenzio to the railing and threw the key aside. Sylvie intended to make Terenzio wait honestly for Ayaz and the others. Terenzio, not expecting this from Sylvie, started cursing furiously. Meanwhile, Ayaz and his group arrived at the crossroads, but Ayaz, disoriented, forgot the route and, by mistake, chose the left turn. They quickly found a bunker gate but not the one where Terenzio was, forever preventing their reunion. They soon discovered this iron gate was also electrified. Horst explained that they could climb over the fence without getting electrocuted if they didn't stand on conductive material and avoided touching the other pole. Immediately, they acted, removing car tires for insulation and using their shirts to cover the fence, following Horst's lead. Everyone eventually climbed over. On the other side, Sylvie and her group had found the bunker entrance. After unlocking the door, Richard and the others quickly carried Osman into the bunker. Still, Sylvie insisted on going back for the others. By then, only 3 minutes and 27 seconds were left until sunrise. Fortunately, Sylvie quickly found Ayaz's group and successfully led them into the shelter. Outside, only the furious Terenzio was left, desperately trying to break free from the handcuffs. But to no avail. He struggled but couldn't reach the key tantalizingly close to him. As the sky gradually turned blue, Terenzio, frustrated, realized the cruel irony. He had saved them only to be heartlessly abandoned. In the end, he watched the rising sun with despair and tears, regretting his fate. The man who had been running for his life from the beginning ultimately couldn't escape his deathly destiny.
He's not here?
No.